So thank you very much for everybody joining us on the call today. We're here for the dwarf tomato breeding webinar with Craig LeHoulier. And this webinar is brought to you by the Citizen Seed Trial Project at Farm Folk City Folk, which has been made possible by our sponsors, Patagonia and TD Friends of the Environment. And the Citizen Seed Trial is a counterpart to the BC Seed Trials, which is now called Kenobi. And is a way to engage gardeners and farmers into the seed conversation. So today, myself, Carla Hick from Farm Folk City Folk, is joining you from the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Syilx and Okanagan people. Steph Benoit is joining us from the land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And Craig LeHoulier is joining us from the unceded and traditional territory of the Cherokee people. And just a few housekeeping pieces here. The participants will be muted throughout the presentation, but we please encourage you to type in the chat box, and if you have any questions, use the Q&A symbol at the bottom of the screen, and Steph and I will monitor the questions that come through, and we will ask those at the end of Craig's presentation. Yeah, and then also too, if there are questions specific to the Citizen Seed Trial, we can wait until after the presentation is over and after we've asked the questions to Craig to then address those. And then just so everyone is aware, this webinar is being recorded, so it will be shared with our communications platforms for people to engage with later, but people won't be able to see your names or any of the questions in the chat box or anything like that. Yeah, and then we'll do our best to stay on time. Just after this quick intro here, Craig will do his presentation till about 12:45, 12:50 Pacific time, and then we'll have some time for questions. Yeah, and then there's my email at the bottom there. If anyone has any questions about Citizen Seed Trial, you're welcome to email as well. Yeah, and then here's Craig joining us from North Carolina on the traditional Cherokee lands, and he's the plant breeder of the F3 Teensy family trial variety that we're using for the 2020 Citizen Seed Trial. He's the co-founder of the Dwarf Tomato Project, author of Epic Tomatoes and Growing Vegetables in Straw Bales, and responsible for naming and popularizing many well-known tomato varieties, including Cherokee Purple. So thank you so much, Craig, for joining us and sharing your knowledge, time, and seed with us. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. And I want to really thank, well, David, who is the seed emissary to get this going, and then Carla and Steph for asking me to do this. It's just an honor and a privilege and just exciting for me to share with you the story of a project that you're participating in. And one of the things Carla mentioned was questions. One of the great things about gardening, there are absolutely no dumb questions, no irrelevant questions, because I'm not an expert gardener. I'm just a gardener. Every year I make mistakes. Every year I learn things. Every year I get a little bit better. And every year something happens that creates a disaster, a deer, a groundhog, weather. So ask anything. Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project, it is really a novel collaborative breeding approach that we've undertaken. And I'm really excited to be able to not only speak to you about this, but to understand how you're participating in this. So I always like to start off just by showing a little bit about where I'm gardening and how I'm doing this myself. So for 28 years, my wife and I and our dogs and cats lived in Raleigh, North Carolina. And that was where we ended up doing our gardening, because that's where the sun shone. It's shown on our driveway, which means I developed a capability of straw bale and container gardening. That was the only way I could grow things well. And it's a lot of fun to do that. I would pick a ton of produce for my driveway. This is what my garden looks like now, because we decided that 28 years of Raleigh heat and Raleigh traffic was more than enough. So we headed for the hills. We went 4 hours west toward where Cherokee Purple originated from, just over the line in Sevierville, Tennessee, as Carla said, Cherokee Indian Territory, and we're in Hendersonville, North Carolina. If anybody knows anything about North Carolina, Hendersonville is about 20 minutes south of Asheville. A really fun place with more restaurants that than you can eat at in a lifetime. And here I am with a big 1/4 acre sunny backyard, but our septic leach field is back there. So I am adapting the same type of gardening, straw bales and container gardening, which means I don't have to take out my shovel and break a sweat and break up all of that beautiful grass that our dogs love to run on. So my dogs, Coda and Marlin, look at this and say, you have built us an obstacle course. So that is their obstacle course. They've never bumped into a plant. They've never tipped over a bag. And I don't know why or how, but this is now. I took this picture a few days ago. So what is amazing about the dwarf tomato breeding project has been the ability for us to discover so much diversity in plants that end up topping out at around 4 feet tall or so, sometimes 5 feet, sometimes 3 feet, depending on the variety. But every tomato on this dining room table was from a dwarf growing plant. And this picture was taken back in 2008. So we've gone a long way since then, which is also why the picture's not great, because the digital aspects of the cameras weren't as good 12 years ago. This is just a little bit to summarize some of the key statistics of this project. We conceived of it in 2005, and I'll tell a little bit about the story of that. Here we are 15 years later. We now have, well, and I haven't really counted in all of you yet into those numbers, and I know I'll have to get from Carla how many people are actually growing seeds, but I would suspect we're up to 700 to 800 volunteers now, 50 states, 25 countries. We have put 123 new named open pollinated, meaning they're stable. If you grow one of these, so these are the dwarfs that are already on the market, and where you are in the project is you're helping us to get there. You're going to be looking at what kind of adventures happen along the way. What are some of the great things you could find? But it's really exciting to think about where we've been. And we've used a completely different way to publicize this, which is bottom up. Find seed companies that want to sell them. Let the companies sell them. Nobody on the project really makes a penny from this, because that's not why we've done it. We've done it to create great varieties for gardeners who are space challenged, who don't want to climb ladders to harvest their tomatoes, who are limited to growing in a patio or a deck. And I think it's been just a marvelous success. So the project was conceived on an old conversational website called Garden Web back in 2005, where Patrina Nusk-Small on the right and I started talking about creating new tomatoes. And we used to in Raleigh have an event called Tomatopalooza, where we would invite all of my tomato seedling customers to bring tomatoes. And for 10 years, we would have up to 300 people, up to 300 different tomatoes, and canker sores. You'd have to break out the Maalox and the Pepto-Bismol later in the day, because people consume so much acid tasting all of those tomatoes, but they learned a lot. We'd arrange them by color. That is Patrina and I manning the dwarf tomato table. And that was 12 years ago, so we were just in our infancy back then. Just to show a little bit about what makes a tomato dwarf and how that differs. So on the right is me in my garden in June in Raleigh, some years ago, standing next to a Cherokee Purple. I'm 6 feet tall. You can tell already that tomato is 8 feet tall. So the characteristic of indeterminates is 95% of tomatoes are indeterminate. It is a dominant trait. You have to stake them. You can let them sprawl, but they're going to take up a very large surface area. You can put them in big cages. The advantages are that they fruit until frost, and the yields can be enormous. And all of that foliage on the plant allows for a lot of photosynthesis, meaning flavors can be truly outstanding. They've got the suckering problem. And no matter who I talk to about gardening, every tomato grower wants to know about what to do about the suckers, the side shoots. We're not going to go into that today because we don't have to worry about that with dwarfs. Determinants, the first of which actually appeared in the mid-1920s, are the balls of the tomato world. They're the ones that look just like tomato varieties until they get about 3 feet tall, and then they spread out, and they fruit like crazy, and you pick about 20 pounds of fruit of plant, and then they're kind of done. So Sophie's Choice, Southern Night, Taxi, Roma, they're tomato machines. Now, what happens is there's so little foliage ratio-wise when compared to the number of the fruit they produce that you're never going to get an incredibly succulently delicious determinate variety. They just genetically aren't programmed to do that. But for sauce, for volume, you've got that. Now, dwarf, which before our project was extremely obscure, most people had not even heard about what it is. It's a third major genetic growth variant of a tomato, and it behaves like an indeterminate tomato, but it grows at half of the vertical rate. So when people ask me how tall do dwarfs get, I say, well, there's so many variables and dependencies. How much direct sun do you get? How many degree days? How much heat? So I say to them, think of a typical indeterminate you may grow, like a Cherokee Purple or a Sun Gold or whatever. Think about how tall that gets by the end of your season the way you grow it. A dwarf will be about half of that height. I have measured dwarf tomatoes, and in my yard they grow about 1 inch a day. Indeterminate tomatoes grow 2 to 3 inches a day. The other characteristics are very stout, and I'm sure you've seen this. They look like no other tomato. The central stem is very thick. The foliage is crinkly looking. This is what dwarf tomatoes look like when they were growing in my driveway in Raleigh. The plants are absolutely gorgeous. The genotype of the leaf shape and type, they're a very dark bluish green. They crinkle. They're enormous. In the front, you can see what a potato leaf dwarf looks like, and it's amazing to see leaves of that size on plants this short. This is an interesting slide because it compares normal growth on the bottom, regular leaf potato leaf, with what happens if it has a dwarf growth habit attached and the leaves crinkle up. That's a regular leaf dwarf on the upper left. It is a potato leaf dwarf on the upper right. That foliage they call rugose, R-U-G-O-S-E. And that is a term that has been used ever since these types were first listed in seed catalogs in the 1850s. So why did we undertake this? Well, because people for years, when I was selling seedlings at the farmer's market, what have you got that tastes great, but I don't have to climb a ladder to pick it and it will grow well in a pot? So the Space Challenge Gardener did not have lots of options. What we had for dwarf type options were simply a handful. Dwarf Stone, 1905, Dwarf Champion, 1892, Golden Dwarf Champion, 1898, New Big Dwarf, 1915, and then Tom Wagner bred lime green salad in the 1970s. But that really represented the extent of dwarf growing tomatoes. Very limited in color, very limited in size, and very limited in flavor types. So I was reading a seed catalog one day. It was an Isbell Seed Company catalog from 1915. And they talked about this new tomato they had, Big Dwarf, and it talked about how they created it. They crossed the biggest tomato they had at the time, Ponderosa, with Dwarf Champion. And they ended up, after doing the hybridization and then selection for a few years, they ended up with 1 pound tomatoes on 3 foot tall plants. It just so happens I found seeds of that tomato in the USDA seed collection. I sent for some. I was probably the first person to grow that in decades. They took it out of cold storage and they sent me the seed. And lo and behold, I had these 3 foot tall plants with these delicious 12 to 16 ounce tomatoes on it. So Patrina and I thought, all we need to do now that we have all these heirlooms of delicious flavors, different kinds of cherry tomatoes, all we need to do is grab the existing dwarfs that we have and start doing crosses and creating new families of tomatoes. And we liked the fact that we were working on dwarfs. Disney did a movie called The Seven Dwarfs, so our first 7 crosses were named after the Disney dwarfs. We've done 100 crosses. Disney did not produce enough names, and that's how we ended up with names like Sleazy and other totally ridiculous names that we've come up with. So I talked about a cross, and let's talk about this a moment to demystify actually how we do this, because making your own tomato is a lot of fun, and it's not difficult. And in fact, what we'll talk about at the end is the fact that I have an Instagram channel, NC Tomato Man, at NC Tomato Man, and every Friday at 3 o'clock my time, Eastern time, I go live from my garden for 45 minutes. And I usually do a demo, and at the last half hour or so, I just take questions. But my demo last week, my wife held the camera, and I actually did a cross. And tomorrow, we're going to look and see if that cross took. What you see here in this slide is you could use an electric toothbrush. This is a specially designed tool you can buy on Amazon and other places called a Veggie Bee that is essentially just a vibrating wand, uses a battery. I like to use a shiny black spoon that comes with it because then you can see the pollen. And then the other tool are tweezers to take the anthers off the flower that you want to apply the pollen to. So on a day where it's not raining and the humidity is not high, you first think about what do you want to cross? And the reason with the dwarf project, I'll get into a little more of the genetics in a moment, but we like to take pollen from tall plants or plants that show recessive traits, plants that show dominant traits, and apply them to the females on plants that have recessive traits. The reason is if a tomato develops and you grow that plant, if the dominant trait shows, you know your cross has worked right off the bat. And that's a little bit of a complicated thought, so I'll get into that again. But go up to a flower from what you want to use as a male, apply the Veggie Bee to the back of the flower, put your spoon underneath. What you see there are the tomato pollen grains, and there's enough pollen there to cross-pollinate about 20 flowers. They're tiny little grains, and if you say pollen from a flower, you can actually just store that in the garage and use it for the next 5 days or so. And there are ways to actually store it for longer use. Now you go, this is the part you really need to be careful of. You decide what you want to cross your pollen onto. And so when I'm creating a new dwarf family, I always use the dwarf tomato as the female. I go up and I look for a flower that's not yet fully 100% open and not yet fully buttery yellow colored. Because what happens with tomatoes is about 80 to 90% of the time, a tomato pollinates as it's opening and the anthers brush against the style, which is the tip of the pistil, and it happens. So you want to get in there and remove the anthers, remove the pollen-bearing bodies before the flower opens and brushes against it. And usually if you use your tweezers and grab the base of the corolla of the flower just right, you can tug it and it will pop off and it will leave the pistil and the style intact. This went really well, but often you're just pulling it off a few anthers at a time. You just relax and take your time and you can find, you get a flower that looks like that. Now, what I like to do at that point is take scissors and clip some of the calyx down so that I can identify that flower as the one that's crossed. And I also take a twisty tie and I tie it around the base of that flower cluster. So that's given me 2 ways now so that I can find that again. So I go to that flower. I know this isn't a great picture, but you can see the pollen in the spoon. And I'll usually take my finger and dip the flower onto the spoon gently because that pistil can break off easily. But when I touch the style onto the pollen, some of it adheres, and that's all there is to do in making a cross. Now, because you pluck the anthers off that flower a few days early, I repeat this on that same flower with the same pollen for the next 3 or 4 days in a row. Go back and check every few days, and what will happen is if a tomato forms, you have an extremely good chance you have just created a new hybrid, and you can mark that with an X, or you can put a number on it, keep a notebook with you so you know what that cross was. And I'm pretty sure that what this was that we're looking at was when I took, I think I took Cherokee chocolate pollen and applied it to dwarf Mr. Snow dwarf, and that's a potato leaf plant. That's all there is to it. Now, when that tomato ripens, that tomato has the hybrid seed in it, and you only need to grow a few because all of the seeds and all of the tomatoes on the hybrid plant are going to have the same genetic material, but you want to save lots and lots of seed so the fun begins. Now we'll get into a little bit more about the genetics here. This is kind of interesting and a bit fun. So for plant habit, indeterminate, tall growing is dominant versus either dwarf or determinate. The toothy regular leaves, the serrated edges, are dominant to potato leaf. Yellow skin color is dominant to clear skin color, and that skin color really determines what you see as the color of a tomato. So the difference between a pink and a red tomato is simply that pink tomatoes like Brandywine have clear skin. Red tomatoes like Big Boy or Better Boy or Big Beef have yellow skin. Flesh color, red is dominant to pretty much all other colors. Fruit size, as you'll see when we look at the actual teensy cross, small is dominant. So you can cross a big tomato with a small tomato and your hybrid will be pretty much all the time a small tomato, and round fruit shape is dominant. So just knowing that, you can look at the list of tomatoes you're growing and you can see what you have growing and you can think, what would I like to create that may not exist yet? I've got a variegated foliage plant yet, but there are no variegated foliage plants with chocolate colored fruit. So I can take variegated, maybe cross it with Cherokee chocolate and see what I get. These are the type of games you can play. So let's dig a little deeper. The reason I use the dwarf as the female is because a successful cross means, so that fruit that you saw with the X on it, when that ripens and I grow seed from that, all of your tomatoes should be indeterminate. And that tells you right off the bat, I've got a successful cross it took. Now, let's say you grow that hybrid out, you name it something, and you save lots of seeds. The seeds you save are F2, second generation. When you grow those out, 75% will show the indeterminate growth habit, and you can either toss them, you can grow them if you want, but 25% will be dwarf. And once you fix that, and save seed from that dwarf plant, and this is what you're all growing out. The reason all of your plants are dwarf is because they're third generation. And once the dwarf genotype is fixed, it sticks with you forever. So it's very easy to stabilize recessive traits because they stabilize quite quickly. Now, if you use potato leaf as a parent, it gets even more complicated because 25% of the 25% of your dwarfs will have potato leaf. The more recessive traits you work in, the more you need to grow out because they're going to be like looking for needles in a haystack. You can pick out dwarf seedlings very easily because they really do grow, even when they're tiny seedlings, and we'll look at a picture, they're half the height of the indeterminates. It can also take 6 to 10 generations to stabilize a new variety. So I've sent you third generation because if you start finding great things in there, and you will, you now have a project where you can save lots of seed, grow out 10, 15, 20 plants. You're still going to have variations right out through the 5th or 6th generation. And one of the more interesting traits is flavor. So let's say in what you're doing right now, you come up with 3 purple tomatoes. They may taste completely different. So you may say, well, I've got the purple color fixed, but I have to keep working because I don't have the flavor fixed yet. And that's what makes this endlessly interesting. So here's what it looks like to compare an indeterminate seedling, which is on the left, with the dwarf seedling, which is on the right. The one in the middle is a determinate, so we'll ignore that right now. But half of the height, let's look at it from a different angle. Look at the thickness of the central stem, especially in relation and in ratio to the height of the plant. That potato leaf indeterminate, which I believe is a Brandywine on the left, is typical for an indeterminate variety. The one on the right, which I believe is Tasmanian chocolate, has a very thick central stem and it's much shorter. And even when you plant the seeds, this is what it looks like if you plant F2 seed. In the back are the indeterminates, and you can see that they're about 2 inches tall and they have slender stems. In the front are the 25% of the dwarfs that you want to hunt out. Now, one of the sad things about this project is all of the stuff that we've left on the cutting room floor, because for the most part, nobody is growing out the indeterminates, and there could be some really fun, interesting color connections. So even outside of the citizen seed trial, if people find this a captivating idea, and you can either make your own crosses and have fun with that, or you can contact me and I can send you some F2 seed from some of the new crosses I've got, and you can help me hunt through some of that. So let's narrow down even further into the teensy cross. One parent was Summertime Green. It is a 1 pound green fleshed, super delicious dwarf variety. This is an example. This shows how we develop Summertime Green. Katrina crossed Golden Dwarf Champion with Green Giant. And one of the best selections out of this that we took out to the F10 generation is Summertime Green. So we crossed a 1 pound indeterminate green fleshed variety with a dwarf growing 4 ounce regular leaf dwarf. And what Summertime Green is a regular leaf 1 pound green flesh dwarf. Mexico Midget just happens to be the smallest tomato I know of. In one of the slide sets that I give, I show where I went to Trader Joe and got some sugar snap peas and removed the peas, and I could comfortably insert the Mexico Midgets into the pea pod. They're tiny. This is an example of what Mexico Midget looks like when it's in a bowl with Sun Golds. Sun Golds is not a particularly large tomato. So here we are, we're crossing a 1 pound green dwarf with a pea-sized indeterminate. That is what the F1 hybrid looks like. Do you remember I said that small fruit size is dominant? So this plant has regular leaf, which is dominant. It has red fruit, which is red flesh, yellow skin, which is dominant. And it has small fruit size, which is dominant. Interestingly, the size of Teensy hybrid is like Sun Gold, which means it's about 10 times larger than Mexico Midget, but it's about 50 times smaller than Summertime Green, its parent. So this is what you're growing out. My friend Linda went dwarf hunting with some of the seed from that little red Teensy F1 hybrid. And one of the things she isolated, she called it tomato number 4. I think it's vial 5751 is what I categorized at. But it is a Sun Gold sized purple cherry tomato. But I know that when you grow this out, you are not going to get all Sun Gold size purple cherry tomatoes because other people have gotten all kinds of things from it. Other possibilities from what you may be seeing are selections that are going to be a little bit larger and tending more towards what Summertime Green may have looked like. We have gotten a lot of mini beefsteaks. We've gotten them in, and those are about 1.5 ounces or 2 ounces, the ones on the left, and even the ones on the bottom. And we've seen these in purple, and we've seen them in chocolate, we've seen them in green, we've seen them in red, and we've seen them in pink. They may be absolutely delicious. They may be incredibly wildly prolific. They may be terrible. And so when you embark on a dwarf tomato project or any kind of a breeding project, you have to be willing to be very honest with the quality of what you're working with. And so I don't know how many vials of seed I've collected already from this project, but a lot of them haven't led to very good outcomes. Some of them have led to absolutely wonderful outcomes. So if we look here, last year, my friend sent me a Teensy purple that was quite advanced. He was up at the 6th or 7th generation. And he also sent me a Teensy pink that was worked out to the 6th or 7th generation. Well, that green tomato on the left is what was supposed to be Teensy purple. And the white ivory colored tomato in the center was what was supposed to be Teensy pink. Now the yellow one on the right it did produce what he expected it to give. This is an extreme close-up. These are about 1/2 ounce cherry tomatoes. The plants we found in the Teensy family resist disease quite well, but the foliage is quite dense. So it's probably appropriate to, if you start seeing some early blight or septoria leaf spot starting to affect plants near the bottom or on the inside, it's very appropriate to remove those leaves. I would mulch well to prevent soil from splashing up. The yields on these will be very heavy. Like I said earlier, the height of the Teensy family tends to be more on the tall side, meaning if an average dwarf out of our dwarf tomato project is maybe 4 feet tall by the end of the year, these may reach a little bit around 5 feet. But Mexico Midget, its parent, is a plant that could easily grow 20 or 30 feet tall. So what you've got is the incredible desire to elongate and grow vigorously in Mexico Midget has been imparted into the Teensy family, but that's still fine. It's still not too difficult to support a 5 foot tall tomato plant that's loaded with tomatoes, much easier than a 20 foot tall plant. The other thing I'll say about Mexico Midget, which is really interesting, and I think it makes this quite a valuable strain of tomatoes to be working with. I've grown in my life about 4,000 different tomatoes. In that time, I have grown one tomato that doesn't germinate like any other, and that's Mexico Midget. It takes forever. Um, I think Mexico Midget probably is closely related to the ancestral original tomato that grew on the coast of South America and was in Central America way back in the 14s and 1500s. And Mexico Midget seems to never get bothered by diseases. It will get a little bit of foliage disease, but it always makes it till frost. Fortunately, the trait of difficult germination did not work its way into the teensy line. And these tomatoes germinate normally. So I'm sure, as you've seen, you have no trouble germinating these. But I think one of the things to look for is that the tomatoes out of this line could have some superior disease fighting characteristics. I think you have high flavor potential, you have high yield potential, you have lots of possibility of diversity of outcomes, but you also want to look at to see how these plants bear up under different conditions, because that will all be really interesting information to have. One more thing about this slide is that how we've done this dwarf project is the person who discovers a particularly wonderful variety earns the right to name it. So these will not be called teensy green, teensy yellow, teensy white. And what was sent to you, teensy purple, is just a purple tomato out of the teensy line. They will get different names. So any of you that think that you have something really noteworthy, this is a great tomato, it needs to be out there, think of a name and share it with me. And then we can work on it over time, find a seed company that may want to put it out, or you may want to sell it. You may want to take it out to Stability and sell it as a benefit to your organization. And you can give them particular names. So this is a special relationship I feel the project has with you guys. In a way, these are yours to take forward and do what you will with. Cross them with other tomatoes, stabilize them into varieties and name them, and then sell them for fundraisers or sell them for yourself. So anyway, lots of flexibility here. So anyway, these are my two books, and I really didn't want to overload with information, so there'd be lots of time for questions. Epic Tomatoes, Growing Vegetables and Straw Bales, they're available everywhere. If I know they're expensive to ship, so if people want to buy them, if they're interested in these books and they want to buy them at their favorite bookstore or Amazon, I have right here, Story has sent me book plates that I can sign the way you like, and then I can stick a book plate and maybe some seeds to you in an envelope just for the asking if you wanted a signed copy of them. So I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to come back to this slide, but Carla, but I wanted to show this slide just because that has a little information. Then I'll go back and we can all talk about contact. So my website, CraigLaHoulier.com, has a lot about the project, has videos. You can email me at either Craig@CraigLaHoulier.com or nctomatoman@gmail.com for any questions at all. You can watch my Instagram lives every Friday at 3 Eastern. I do newsletters, and the book on this I'm going to call Crowd Breeding, because that's what we have done. We have used a crowd of people from all over the world to breed great new tomatoes. I'm going to self-publish it. I've been talking about finishing this book for 2 years, but damn it, I can't stop gardening long enough to sit down and write the bloody thing because I'm having so much fun in the garden. It's hard to just sit in front of my laptop. I am now going to turn it back to Carla for this slide, but first I want to just thank you all for, well, thanks to David for expressing interest in asking to jump into this. And thank you all for your participation, your interest, for coming to listen to me babble at you for 45 minutes. And this is what I love to do. I hope you got something from this, and I hope I can learn something from all of you as well. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Craig. Love hearing about all those intricacies of the project. So yeah, we open it up to questions. Are there any questions from the participants? you're either welcome to type them in the chat box, Q&A, or we can certainly unmute you and you can have the floor. There's one lady that says I love getting your tomato book from the local library, but it's worth many reads, so a personal book is key. Thank you, Craig. That's really nice. Yeah, there's no questions popped up just at the moment.
So Carla, Steph, David, any of you guys want to ask anything to open things up to areas that
right.
you know, we may have not dove into quite as deep for time consideration, but we've got some time now and we could maybe, you know, peel a little more deeply into things.
Right. Well, one observation that I've made between the dwarf tomato and then our control that we're using, the Soleil cherry tomato, I've noticed that the dwarf tomato stem is very hairy compared to the indeterminate Soleil, which I thought was really interesting. I was just wondering, is there a reason for that? Is it a dominant, a recessive trait, or does it have a purpose, or is it just one of those things that we don't really know why?
I would call it a spectacular observation that is going to now send me into the garden to go look at the stems of all my dwarf tomatoes. So I hope they're not shy out there. So a few things come to mind. So you got a tomato plant, an indeterminate that stretches really quickly upwardly. And I'm sorry, my scientist is going to come through. So there's a few theories here. Do tomato plants have a certain number of hairs per square inch per stem? In a dwarf plant where you're slowing down that vertical growth, are you just making those little hairs more compact per surface area? But you can think of all kinds of different things. Number one, you know, what are the actual evolutionary or ecological benefits of those little hairs, and is it an advantage to have more of them? So every question creates a research project, Carla.
Absolutely.
And, yeah, I think that's a fantastic observation, and it would be interesting to know if other people see the same things or if it could be selection specific.
Yeah, something definitely to keep an eye on. And I wonder maybe as a result, if it makes the stem a little bit more disease or pest resistant, because it might be more difficult for something to latch onto.
Aren't they pretty plants though?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're really great. I'm looking forward to when I do get tomatoes on mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be interested if you want to ask in a chat, or if people want to ask how people's germination has been in the seeds, because typically seeds I've gotten from Linda Black have been at least 80%. So I would hope people are, you know, those seeds are probably about 3 or 4 years old, so germination rate should still be optimal. You know, I've found germination rate in tomatoes is great up until about 10 or 11 years. You start seeing a little drop off at 12 years, and then they really start going bad at around 14 years.
Right. Yeah, really good germination for me. I think it was around 70, 75, and definitely more than the Soleil control, which was nice to see.
Good.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions that have rolled in now.
Okay.
And then people, you're also welcome to comment on the germination, what you've been finding with the germination. So we've got one question here. What is your favorite dwarf variety?
Oh my! So you're asking Dad to pick his favorite kid. This is just, you know, oh man. So full confession, we have so many dwarfs now, 123, that there is still at least 50 I've not grown yet, and I'm taking care of some of that this year. So we have some amazing volunteers that have really gone into this in a big way. One of them is Susan Oliverson in Idaho, who has almost done all the legwork on at least 3 dozen of our new releases. But so far, actually the parent of Teensy, Summertime Green, is in my top 10 for flavor. I mean, it is probably the first result we got out of the project that confirmed to me we were onto something, because when I grew that and tasted it, I thought we have actually created a dwarf version of a Green Giant. However, given that, and given that there is a tomato named Dwarf Sweet Sue, and given that my wife of 40 years is the Sweet Sue the tomato was named for, I have to call that my favorite for flavor right now. It is actually a sister tomato to Summertime Green. Um, that Green Giant Golden Dwarf Champion Cross led to Kelly Green, Beryl Beauty, Jade Beauty, Sweet Sue, Summer Sweet Gold, Emerald Giant, and Summertime Green, and Mr. Snow. So that, Green Giant actually is one of the best 5 tomatoes I've ever eaten. And somehow the genetic excellence of the flavor of Green Giant made it into that cross with Golden Dwarf Champion, which is actually a pretty blah tomato. To just create, everything that's popped out of that family has been spectacular. Now, one of the things I'll mention to people, if you are interested in doing your own crosses or crossing an indeterminate with your teensy, just to see what you get, hybrids, you can take the 2 best tasting tomatoes and the hybrid could be really average flavored. And then you take that on and all the good flavor starts popping out again in subsequent generations. You can think you've isolated the best flavored tomato you've ever eaten and then grow it into the next generation, and you lose the flavor for a generation or 2. So it seems it is easy to create interesting tomatoes. It is not, it takes time and patience to create interesting, easy, worthwhile, spectacular flavored, stable tomatoes. So this is a project that actually can last a lifetime. I mean, I could spend the next 30 years of my life just continuing to play with this. There's so much to discover and learn. And it's not really, to me, about putting great new tomatoes out there. In parallel to that is what we can teach ourselves as gardeners about how tomatoes work, the genetics, you can go to a book and read some of this stuff, but it's a whole heck of a lot more fun to do it yourself and learn and be Gregor Mendel with his peas and go out in the garden and learn all of these things.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. So one person commented on the hair comment and said, I heard that each hair can turn into roots. I've been advised to bury my tomato stems a bit to encourage rooting. Do you know anything about this?
So I know that, well, so 2 things. Number 1, yes. Tomatoes are best planted very deeply because any part of the stem that's below the soil will produce roots. Now, whether I really want to look that up about the hairs and the roots, because I've been getting a lot of emails under certain weather conditions. People are worried because where the stem is near the soil line, all of a sudden there are roots that are forming on the part of the plant above the ground and then going to the soil, and they wonder if their tomato's sick. And those are called adventitious roots. And they're just a phenomenon that's probably a physiological or weather effect where the tomato just decides it wants to form some roots and go back and maybe pick up some more moisture in the soil. Just things to, but they're just observations to notice. But yeah, the hair root thing, see, I love homework. You guys, you've given me homework. It's good stuff.
Love it. Okay, and then the same person was asking, would you ever want to cover the hand-pollinated flowers with bags to prevent insect pollination?
You could, but the reason I don't is because once I've removed the ring, the anther ring, the corolla, that flower, number 1, it's no longer attractive to insects. Number 2, there's really no place for the insect to land on to get an easy purchase and then mine for pollen. So if somehow a bee decided to land on the plant and had pollen on its body and it kind of fell down onto the style, you certainly could. But I've not gone to that trouble. I tend to be a pretty, what's the word? I'm not a lazy gardener, but I try to get the biggest bang for my effort for the buck. Now, bagging blossoms for sure is the best way. If you've got a rare heirloom or if you're maintaining different heirloom varieties and you want to really guarantee that you're not getting cross-pollination, then the very best thing you can do is to bag a blossom cluster before any of those flowers open, let the flowers pollinate. Once the tomatoes form, remove the bag, and you can guarantee that all of the tomatoes in that cluster will be true to type. But so far I've found pretty good luck. Now, one of the things maybe to worry about a little bit, and this is happening to me now, is I've done a bunch of crosses, and I told you I like to repeat them, and it rains the next day, and I worry that the rain falling on that pistil may have knocked off the pollen, and I also worry that day I can't get out to collect more pollen to apply. So I've got 10 crosses going, indeterminate to indeterminate, just because I feel like playing a little bit before my dwarfs flower. And I'll be interested to see how well those 10 crosses took. But if you do tune in to my lives on Friday, I'll be giving people kind of a blow on how it went. And I'm not a Martha Stewart gardener. If I've got disease, I'll show it. If I'm having a depressing garden day, I'll talk about it. COVID has created so many new gardeners. Seed companies cannot keep up. So what I try to do now is make myself available so those first-time gardeners don't get discouraged and they have somewhere to go to ask even some of their basic questions, because I want to turn them into forever gardeners. So, come to my Fridays, ask anything, and I'll tell you what I know. And if I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know it.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, it's, you get the lessons in the failures as well as the successes. So we
Yeah.
shouldn't be shy of those, and shouldn't be shy to ask those
No.
questions. All right, another question here. Do you know if the large spray-like trusses of some cherry tomatoes are dominant or recessive? Example in Riesenstraub.
Riesentraub, Ildi, I've got a bunch of those. Yeah, that the multiflora characteristic. I tend to think that multiflora is a recessive trait, but once you've got it nailed down, then it should be easy to maintain that. So but it's a great question, because one of the places we haven't gone yet is to take a Riesentraub or an Ildi or a rose quartz multiflora, cross that with one of our dwarfs to see if we can create multiflora dwarfs. So there's a project there waiting to happen. And if somebody is growing Riesentraub or a multiflora and you're in this teensy project, even though you're only at the F3 or F4, dwarf is fixed and cherry is fixed. Well, cherry is maybe not fixed, but dwarf is fixed. Cross it on. Cross your Riesentraub with one of your teensy dwarfs, create a hybrid, save some seed from it, and undoubtedly you will end up with some multiflora dwarfs out of that may be incredibly good leads for future varieties.
Cool. Okay, and then so we have, to clarify, the pimp is in the family name, comes from Solanum pimpinifolium, which is in the Mexico midget.
That we think, it's never been tested, but I strongly believe that Mexico midget is a pimpinifolium tomato, one of the that other major. Now I've got to think about all my Solanum esculentum, pimpinifolium. Yeah, so it's a subtype of a currant tomato. So it probably is, Mexico midget probably is, another word for it would be a currant type. But I've never had it, genetically tested. One of the interesting things about Mexico midget, another interesting thing is germination is so poor that essentially I'm the only person still anywhere that anybody can obtain it from, because no seed company can sell it because it can't be made at this point to meet any kind of germination standards. So I know my friend Mike Dunton in Victory has it, and he's really frustrated because he can't sell it. Seed Savers Exchange is selling Mexico midget, but it's not Mexico midget. It's crossed. It's about 10 times too large, and it germinates normally. I did try an experiment last year at the request of a friend that seems like it may be one of the secrets of it. So they said, have you ever thought, while you're fermenting Mexico midget, to take the fermentation liquid from a different variety and add just some of the liquid into your fermenting Mexico midget, let it go through the fermentation, save the seeds, and see what happens? So I did. I had my Mexico midgets fermenting, a different variety was fermenting. I decanted some of the liquid in. And this year, when I germinated that Mexico midget seed, I got 80% within 5 days. So I'm onto something. What I don't know is exactly what it is. And it could be just that Mexico midget, as it's germinating, doesn't produce the proper pH, the proper environment to completely remove the germination inhibitor that is on each seed that typically gets removed during fermentation. So once we sort this out, then I can share it with seed companies, and maybe they can sell this variety, but put a different type of, they have to use a different fermentation technique to create it. But it's a great question.
Interesting.
So,
thank you. And then we have, how many plants of the F2 generation do you generally plant to see the traits you want in the F3 generation?
So as I said, I'll create a hybrid and I'll only plant a couple of the hybrid out because I know the seed will be the same. And if it shows all the dominant traits, I've got my cross and I'll save lots of that seed. Let's say I plant 100 F2 seeds out. I'll end up with 25 dwarfs. And optimally, so if we were to have done this project right, if we were funded, if we were a seed company, we probably would have planted 1,000 F2s, which means you'd get 250 dwarf plants. You'd see the full range, or maybe even not the full range, but you'd see the vast majority of what types of traits are going to be expressed in the different dwarfs. So the way that we've done this project has been limiting due to just the resources we've had and the time that we've had. We know we've gotten out some really good stuff. What we don't know is all the stuff we've left behind. So when you're in the early generation numbers, the bigger populations you grow out, the more that you find. But some of the crosses we're doing are so wide. I mean, a pea-sized cherry tomato with a 1 pound green flesh, we don't know how many F2s it would take to grow out to find all of the bizarre and interesting possibilities that could pop out. Why haven't we found even an 8-ounce tomato in the F2 yet? So clearly, genetics are kind of pushing us towards the smaller fruit. But I think if we would have grown out enough, we would have started seeing some of the phenotypes that we haven't observed yet. So as in all of these cases, the more you grow out, the more you find. And you never know exactly what you're looking for until you see what pops out. So you can think if I cross A and B, I'll surely get C. And maybe you just get D, E, F, and G, and you never quite see the C you're looking for because there's linkage that's happening that you weren't aware of. Maybe the trait you're looking for is linked to a different trait that may preclude it from expressing. You know, and one of my challenges when I write the Dwarf Tomato Project book is to try to take tomato genetics to a level where it's interesting and easily understandable and applicable, because from my experience, there are some really good genetics books written out there, but even with my PhD in chemistry, I read these books and I really don't know what they're talking about because it's way up here, deep into botany. And you know, we've got to forget that most of us are gardening for the fun, for the food, maybe for the stories, for the interest, for exercise. So my goal is always to demystify all of these little projects we can do and make them fun and understandable to everyone so that we can all take part in it and all be part of it and all discover things ourselves. So as you already can see, you ask question A and you get answers B, C, D, E, but you know, as my wife says, I tend to talk a little bit.
And that's okay. Thank you. We're very grateful for your knowledge. Okay, and then in the past, I've grown wild tomatoes that were very blight tolerant. Have you noticed that with Mexico Midget?
Yeah, and when you're saying blight, so the things that I've seen that Mexico Midget seems to handle quite well is Alternaria, which is early blight, Septoria leaf spot, and it even seems to be somewhat resistant to Fusarium wilt, which is you know, one of the really bad diabolical fungi that work their way up through the roots. But again, I've not done a systematic study of that. You know, so a lot of people have said, well, the next place you need to take the dwarf breeding project is to take your releases and either, well, you need to breed for disease tolerance or resistance, or you need to evaluate the ones you've got out there for what disease resistance and tolerances they have. I would love to do all of that. It is hard work, it's resource intensive, it's people intensive. And so I thought, well, our main contribution is to launch the project and to work on the fun parts, flavors, colors, size, shapes. And at some point in time, if some of these things really are good tomatoes and people love them, but the biggest issue is they have issues with disease, then that would be time for a seed company then to take, say, Dwarf Sweet Sioux and start working either with, you know, start making grafts of them with disease-resistant rootstock, or start working in doing some additional hybridization to see if you can work in some disease tolerance. And the other thing that I would like to do is, and I'm working with an organization called SeedLinked to maybe embark on this, is to let's take 5 of our dwarfs and let's distribute them around the continent, and let's see which ones of them do well where, which, because that's what we don't know either. I've got 123 kids and I don't know which ones of them are happy in which state. Do people in New England love them or hate them? Do people in Washington State find that they die too easily? Do they not ripen for people up in Vancouver?
Mhm.
So we're 15 years into this breeding project and we essentially know very little, which is a testament to how much work it is and how much we really should appreciate, what seed companies do and what farmers do.
Mhm.
It takes a lot of dedication. It takes a lot of time, but boy, does it pay off. And it's really, really interesting stuff. So I'm hoping we can learn a little bit more about all of these. And, so which ones will become heirlooms? So of the 123 that are out there, will people be growing any of them in 50 years or 75 years or 100 years? The court of public opinion will decide that. And I'm very happy that my offspring through this project will be subject to that rigorous approval process. They need to be. We need to succeed when we grow stuff.
Mm-hmm. That's good. All right. And then I'm wondering if the dwarf lines all display equal disease and pest resistance.
Not at all.
Okay. And then, sorry, just the last part of the question
Yeah.
here. I grow heirlooms for seed production, and I'm looking for best disease resistance before I begin hybridization.
Yeah, they're all over the map. So, and here's how I think about it. We started with, when we first started the project, we started with varieties that have been around since the 1800s and that no one had ever tested to see if there are any natural disease resistances and tolerances. And as breeding partners, we used delicious heirloom varieties, again, of which, as far as I know, they've not been put through systematic testing for their resistance or tolerance to different diseases. So we've created these crosses, and again, it's part of the answer to that question is the last question. We're still in the process of finding out. And until we get that feedback, all evidence at this point is kind of anecdotal and guesses. So maybe my friend in Idaho says, wow, this plant yielded well and did really well this year. Well, maybe that's a hint. I can ask them, what diseases do you typically have? Well, we have verticillium, we have early blight. This tomato held up pretty well, but we don't have any testing data to back that up. All we have is the anecdotal evidence from people who are growing them in different areas of the country. I know that the very dense foliage of all of our dwarf tomatoes means that when they're grown in very hot, humid areas, they're going to be prone to foliage diseases like early blight and septoria, because the spores get inside the plant, the sun doesn't hit the plant, you don't have good air circulation. So they really need good disciplined growing to maybe thin some of that thick foliage out and open the plant up a little bit. So that's really all I can say about that at this point. Is it's a great question and the answer is yet to be written.
Awesome. And then another question here, how do you decide which seed companies will carry the dwarf tomatoes?
The ones that, and this is where it's kind of funny, it's the ones that have expressed interest, and so I could talk to 100 gardeners and maybe 3 of them would think that this is an interesting project that they want to participate in. I could go to 20 seed companies and maybe 2 or 3 of them would say, well, it's really competitive out there. Having something a little different and a little new and something unique would give us maybe a little bit of a competitive advantage so that I can compete with companies A, B, and C. So right off the bat, the first companies we thought about were ones that we knew from the Tomatoville website. So Tatiana's Tomato Vase, she's up in Vancouver area. Tatiana Kucherevna, she's got a seed company, Samples, Tatiana's Tomato Base. She was interested off the bat. Sample Seed Shop, Remy in New York was interested. Mike Dunton, who's a good friend of mine who owns Victory, he just loves this stuff. He and I went hunting for all the Livingston varieties together. We canvass seed banks. We collect seed catalogs. This was right up his alley. So he made a point right from the start saying, I want Victory to be kind of the go-to place and I'm going to carry all of your dwarf varieties. Um, our model of getting them to the companies is kind of interesting. We ask them if they're interested, and then we just give them the first 2,000 seeds of a particular variety and say, go for it. So the project itself makes no income from this. Our view is this is an income stream from smaller seed companies to be able to establish a little something unique so that they can do well from it. And you know, I may be angering those people that think that tomato breeders need to get paid X, Y, or Z. It's not that I don't need or like a little bit of spending money now and then. I just thought the whole spirit of this project was to give gardeners who had a lack of something critical, great tasting varieties they can grow in space challenge areas, and just do it for the good of gardening, and then just see what happens. So it's been a delightful experience. I can't believe 15 years are gone by. Once they're out there, so Fruition was interested in it. I've become good friends with them, and they've jumped on board. And Tomato Fest in California has become interested, and they've jumped on board. But I'm no longer the source to them. What they do is they go to the seed companies that are selling them, and they purchase the seeds, and then they start selling themselves. So if you look at Dwarf Sweet Sue, Dwarf Emerald Giant, ones that have been out there the longest, you can find now 25, 30 companies around the world that are selling them where they started with one. And I think that's kind of fun to see how it ebbs and flows over time.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you. So just looking at the time here, we're just a little bit past 1 p.m. Pacific time. So I will just say thank you very much to everybody who has participated today. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, David. Thank you to our earth and our land, all the people. We can stay on the call for a little bit longer if there are any further questions. And please feel free to note our email addresses and send any follow-up questions. Check out Craig's lives on Fridays. For anybody that is in the Lower Fraser Valley, Abbotsford area, we are having a gathering at the seed farm on Saturday, and we will be doing a farm tour and then looking at the citizen seed trial crops as well. That'll go from 1 to 4 p.m. Pacific time. So if anyone's interested in that, the event is posted on Facebook, and then you're welcome to get in touch with us as well. And we will do a little bit of a video recording so that we can share that virtually with people as well.
Question I had, Carl, do you know how many people are actually growing dwarf tomatoes at this point from that 5751 reference?
I haven't looked the number up specifically recently, but I do have a note in my notebook here somewhere. I know that we have about 250 people participating in the citizen seed trial. Overall, not everyone's doing tomato. I have here, last time I checked, 67 people are doing the trial.
One idea I had, maybe when yields are coming in, if you wanted to reschedule one of these where we could just talk about results. People could do show and tell. We could have a blast comparing notes.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah, and with that said, is there anybody on the call that has noted any specific variations within the dwarf tomatoes or comparisons between the dwarf and the Soleil variety that you'd like to share? One thing I had noted, I thought the color is quite interesting of the leaves, well, and off the entire plant. On the Soleil, seeing a little bit of purpling on the stem, and then there's purpling underneath the leaves as well, which you don't see on the dwarf variety at all. And then with the leaf color, the dwarf variety is quite vibrant, like lime green, maybe a touch of yellow. And then with the Soleil, it's darker green.
Interesting.
And I'm just I'm curious as to why that is, and maybe I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Craig?
What I've found, and I'm looking up Soleil right now, what I've found actually is that if you grow enough tomatoes, you just see like an array of slight variations in foliage color that you wouldn't pick up if you were to just kind of say, oh, there's a tomato plant. But if I grow Cherokee green next to Cherokee purple, Cherokee green is just a bit of a shade lighter green. If I've found that the big bicolored beefsteaks, you know, Ruby Gold, Georgia Streak, their foliage is a more blue tinged green color than the other varieties. So there are clearly some secondary genetic characteristics that may get carried into a particular fruit type. And it may be the same thing with the plant type. Why your observation is interesting to me is Mexico midget itself is always a lighter green colored tomato. So right now I've got 5 cherry tomatoes. I've got Sun Gold, Fruity, Black Cherry, Egg Yolk, and Mexico midget. And I can just look from across the yard, and by looking at the color of the leaves, I can tell which one's Mexico midget. So clearly, and that's when you know you need a drink, or you're a little too deep into this, is you start, you start, you know, it's, yeah, it's time to maybe step out of the garden, you know, step away from the keyboard, take a rest. Getting into this a little too deep.
But, yeah.
But it is fun to notice those things because they're important. They tell you something, right?
And then, you know, when I was first hardening off the plants, and I'm putting my little seedlings in the sunshine, you know, maybe it got a little bit too hot on my balcony at first. And I was noticing that the Soleil leaves didn't seem to react as well to the heat and the sunshine beating down on them as the dwarf tomatoes, and there was a little bit of burning on the leaves and maybe some white spots. And then I was kind of wondering, well, maybe that has something to do with the color or the leaf structure, but I wasn't quite sure.
So this year, you know, we sell seedlings every year, and this is my first year doing it from Hendersonville, and I have to adjust to the temperatures here. And we had some really cool nights. So we're talking, you know, I had 2,000 plants out there when it hit 33, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty cold. I mean, they were hardened off. We're that far from frost. And my indeterminates really did not look good at all. The foliage got blemished and marked, and it turned really purple in some cases. And all of the dwarf varieties looked like, you know, they spent the day at the beach. I mean, so I don't know if it's that crinkly rugose foliage translates to a thicker, more, you know, stress resistant type of a leaf structure or what. Again, we haven't, and you know, what's really funny about it is the first dwarf tomato was listed in the catalog in the 1850s, and it was called Delaye, Delaye, and it was a little red tomato that appeared in a garden in France, and it made its way over to US seed companies. That was the only one. And then all of a sudden, Dwarf Champion pops up, and it was always called, they were always called very useful tomatoes because they stay short, but no one ever did anything with them. No one ever expanded them into different varieties. And I think it's because it took the ascendancy of all of the heirloom types following the formation of the Seed Savers Exchange in the mid-70s. All of a sudden, we had all of these interesting tomatoes to use as breeding partners where they didn't between, you know, the 1850s and 1970. Tomatoes were they were red, they were big, or maybe they were red and they were medium. So we're the luckiest people ever in all of time. And if we're tomato lovers, having the diversity that we do to play around with, we are extremely lucky to be able to do what we do. And I know you said, Carla, you went to cooking school once. All this diversity of fruit shape and size and color makes chefs light up. I mean, you can't get enough of these things. And then you start realizing some of them are tart and some of them are sweet. And you can really play with your food if you get into this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. And each tomato having a place for everything, whether it's in your salad or a cooking sauce tomato or we would always love, you know, in the kitchens during the summer, getting all the heirloom tomatoes in, and you know, the chef would tell you, like, don't put them in the fridge, they've never seen a fridge, don't disrespect the tomatoes. And you know, they stayed on the line, and we would cut them to order so that they wouldn't lose any of their juice. And you know, you have the mix of the colors on the plate, just very beautiful. So
and you realize that actually once you make sauce out of them, or once you cut them, you actually cut in half the number of different colors you have, because the color of a tomato is the skin over the flesh. So if you cut a Cherokee chocolate and a Cherokee purple in half and put them cut side up, they'll look like the same tomato. If you take a red Brandywine and a Brandywine and cut them, they'll look like the same tomato. So you need to use them in raw preparations where you've got some of the skin left on. That gives you, why are we talking cooking? I'm starved now.
Yeah. Oh,
A
fun.
serious business, this tomato stuff, I tell you.
Yeah, I love talking about food all day, and then I'm, eat
Yeah.
some lunch, eat some dinner, just every day.
Well, I've got some recipes to share with you, Carla. For breakfast today, I had fresh made strawberry lemon poppy seed scones.
That sounds wonderful.
It
I don't even
worked.
want to tell you what I have for breakfast now. That's definitely trumps what I had. But yeah, no, that would be great too. Like if people could, we could get a little bit recipe sharing going on
Yeah, yeah.
throughout this. That would be wonderful. We have a Facebook group, the Citizen Seed Trial. We could do some recipe sharing there,
Sure,
and
sure.
maybe I could set up more of like a portal on the blog for people to do that. And then I'm just noticing some comments here. One lady has just sharing her observations about her plants. It says, my Soleil plants are 3 times the height. They are also more spaced out foliage than the dwarfs. And then the dwarfs are very tight and feathery leaves and dense foliage.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. That's how they grow. And, a lot of people ask about the relative yields of dwarf with indeterminate. And it's almost an unfair comparison, because if a plant is half the height of the other, by definition, you can't expect them to have the equivalent yield. But I think foot for foot on the plant, you can expect the same yield. So a 4-foot dwarf will probably give you the same success as 4 feet of a Cherokee purple, for example. The fact that they're smaller means you can space them a little bit closer. People should not go out and replace all their indeterminates with dwarfs. What they should do, if they're interested in as a type of tomato to make their gardening more interesting or more flexible, and I say this to anything, whether they want to try straw bale gardening or container gardening or whatever, never try something new in gardening. Never go all in and go wild, because you may not like it. So just ease in, try a few, give it, and see if you like it. This is how to avoid gardener disappointment. And so, I've given a straw bale talk. That's all I'm going to do next year. I'm going to buy 40 straw bales and do it. I'm like, no, don't. It's different. You have to learn it first. You have to ease into it. You have to see if it's for you. And but that's what kind of makes it fun. Make each one of your gardens a little bit. Incorporate something new. Incorporate something fun. Do a tried and true. Stretch yourself a little bit, and see how it all works out.
Right on. So that's all I'm seeing for questions now, but there's a couple of comments. One person has said, Carla, Steph, and especially Craig, this was an amazing webinar. Craig, your enthusiasm is contagious and your knowledge is deep, and your honesty and care in what you say is so appreciated. Thank you for sharing.
That means a lot. That's how I really want to do it. So thank you very much.
And then another comment. Thank you, Craig. This has been very interesting and inspirational. And I'm so sorry now that I haven't participated in the seed trial.
Yeah, but there's always next year.
There is always next year. Yeah. We have opened up the educational material to people who want to follow along with the seed trial. So not just the people who are growing the seed. So please keep following along with us. We'd love to hear from you. We're happy to share knowledge. And there is always next year, so you can start to look for the signing up for that around December, January. If you just keep posted to our Facebook pages, the bcseeds.org, farmfolkcityfolk.ca websites, and we'll make wide announcements and make sure that we get everybody who wants to participate to be involved. But having said that, we welcome people growing their own plants and doing their own variety trials and sharing their knowledge with us. Like if you've noticed something interesting or you want to know something specific, please reach out. We certainly love hearing from all of you. yeah, so that's, that's about it. If there's any more questions, please just type them in there. I see that there is one person that has joined us via phone. I realize maybe they might not be able to answer any or type any questions into the chat box. So I'll just kind of unmute you for a second there. And is there any questions that you'd like to ask via phone? No, okay. All right, just thought I'd give them that opportunity there.
You just freaked them out now.
Yeah, like, whoa. Wasn't expecting that. Alrighty, well, thank you so much, Craig. Thank you for your time and
Well, thank you.
information. Someone here thank you so much. I learned a lot about dwarf tomatoes. This is one of the best Zoom gardening presentations that I have ever seen since COVID started.
Oh gosh, well, thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah, and thank you to everybody that's participated. Yes, I'll just keep going around in circles saying thank you now. So
Everybody have a wonderful day. Go out and dig in the dirt, get your hands dirty, have fun. I'm going to go out and the rain stopped, so I'm going to go make some crosses.
Awesome, awesome. Yes, and for people that are in the Citizen Seed Trial, please make sure you log into SeedLinked and upload your data. We definitely want to see that, and the more data we have, the more conversations we can have later about the traits that we're seeing.
Yeah, I'm doing a basil trial and a tomato trial in SeedLinked as well for the first time this year, and I'm in conversations with them to just kind of expand, what I do with them. It's a really great concept that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely helping kick variety trials up into the next level.
Yep.
Alrighty. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.